Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's long-range forecast video brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. This analysis is being provided for perspective only, and any decision made based upon this presentation is the sole responsibility of the person making the decision. Finally, please remember that all long-range weather forecasting is speculative by nature. Well, our pattern over the last 2 weeks has given us these temperature anomalies across North America. And in general, we've had quite a bit of ridging here that's kind of come around into a highly amplified pattern that's done something quite a bit like that line I just drew there. So even though many of you watching this in the Midwest, so wait a minute, we've had a warm anomaly over the last couple of weeks. What we have when we average it all together, even though the temperature patterns have actually been quite volatile, and we've had some pretty big low pressure systems sweep through that have really dropped the temperatures off. But here in the western part of the United States, there has been the cool bias. And the big questions we have to ask ourselves is that flow pattern, which has given us this precipitation pattern, going to continue? Remember, with the flow doing something like this, okay, what we end up getting here is a drier northwest kind of United States, simply because the flow is coming out of the northeast there, but several cutoff lows that keep coming through California, ejecting into the Central Plains, which has really blanketed this area in a lot of snow, very heavy rainfall here, while the southeast has been missing out on a lot of this. And as these systems kind of accumulate or kind of congregate here over the northeast, we have at least recently had some big snows there with the last system that has kind of exited through this area. So again, my questions in this video is this the new pattern as we progress through the end of the month, or is anything kind of changing that we need to be discussing here? Because looking at our calculated soil moisture anomalies here at the beginning of December, where we are extremely wet and our soils are right up here in the north central plains, moving through the Great Lakes states and also getting into parts of the mid-south. You can see here that some of those locations have better than 4 inches of excess water in the soil there as we get into the Dakotas over toward Wisconsin. And down here in the Mid-South, numbers are pretty high as well, 2 to 3 inches of excess. Meanwhile, parts of the Pacific Northwest have been dry, and we need to ask ourselves if that's going to continue. Same thing with what you see over here, because I'm anticipating where I just drew that arrow right down here, some big changes in the near term. Now, let me show you what we could potentially add to this area, because sitting on top of those already saturated soils is this much water when it comes to our snow water equivalent, which means if we were able to melt that snow off, we have an additional 2 inches of liquid equivalent in the snow that could go in and really make things quite flood prone and very, very muddy as we move through. I'm talking about this quarter and through here. By the way, parts of Montana, North Dakota have actually already seen an entire winter's worth of snowfall out of these last few systems that have come through, plus the ones we had back in September and October. So it's been an incredibly snowy year for a lot of folks in the north central part of the United States. So let's get into the forecast. Well, over the next week, this is what we're looking at in terms of precipitation anomalies. GFS ensemble left, European ensemble right. Both models are very much keyed in on the wet pattern that's going to be coming in here into California and parts of the southwest, while the northwest is staying on the drier side of things. A relatively calmer pattern as we progress through this week, getting into the weekend here for the Midwest and the northern plains. And you can see here that much of the East Coast is going to be on the less active side as well. But this will be changing as we get into week 2. I'll show you that in just a few seconds. Just looking in the near term, we're going to watch a clipper move across the north part of the U.S.-Canada border. We have a little shortwave that's coming out of the Four Corners that toward the end of the week will be kind of skirting here, such that might bring about a ½ inch of rainfall to parts of Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas toward the end of the week. But big section of the Corn Belt and the Central Plains relatively dry, as is Texas. Much of the effort in terms of the atmosphere producing precipitation is going to go to the northern half of California. I'm going to show you exactly why that's happening too. And just to keep you up to date, our more active pattern won't begin until next week, and we'll probably get kicked off with the system on Monday. And so to continue with the conversation we've been having this week, we still see that Monday, December the 9th, midday low pressure forming in both the European and the GFS here. So we're keeping a close eye on that. This is, of course, going to be fed on high pressure sitting just off the coast, pumping in that moisture. So that is going to be, I think, the beginning of our more active week 2 time period. And this is what we see. GFS week 2, European week 2. This is both ensemble forecasts. You can see that they're really cranking up this pattern. Now, to me, what this suggests is a much more active subtropical jet stream. This suggests a bit more of a split flow pattern out west. We can even see that here. Look at how the precipitation anomalies are doing this with the wet and keeping the drier now coming into Northern California. Both models keying in on that on week 2. So we have to ask ourselves some big questions about this pattern and where it's going, and does it persist as we get into the 3rd and 4th week of December, because it is certainly cranking up here. Good evidence for this as we move now into the 2nd full week of the month. Just to keep you aware of what's going on with snowfall, looking over the next 10 days, these maps from the European right, GFS left, we're looking at the probability here of grabbing another 3 inches of snow. And really, if we just kind of notice here, that region that is blanketed in snow right now, this area, the probabilities are quite low. In other words, we don't see big low pressure systems coming barreling out of the mountains and on a trajectory like this. Our flow pattern is going to be, like I said, a bit more split, and it's going to come down more out of the Canadian prairies. And so let's take a look at what that means in terms of our temperatures here too. So trough ridge pattern analysis, GFS ensemble left, European on the right. Playing this forward, models are really synchronized in the near term. So what do we have? Well, if we just kind of let that slide quickly, I'm watching 2 troughs, this one here and this one here. So this trough is the one that's giving us the little clipper through the northern part of the U.S. This is the one that's coming out of the Four Corners, and it's going to get over to the lower Mississippi River Valley by the end of the week. So you can see I'm moving across right there. Subtle features, not too much to talk about, but overall this trough keeps the next 5 days cool along the East Coast. Meanwhile, the pattern relaxes in the midsection of the country, right in through here, and this is going to bring in some warmer temperatures. While out west, this trough, the one you've been watching here, is going to keep pummeling northern parts of California over the next several days. Now, why is it going to be drier in the Pacific Northwest? Well, the trough is too far south. We need to take this feature and move it farther to the north. That would bring better onshore flow to parts of Oregon and Washington, which is why you saw the drier bias there and wetter in northern California. Okay, how's the pattern get going past this weekend? Well, you start to notice this. A trough begins to anchor itself here on the Hudson Bay and extends cold air down into the central United States. This is the European solution, GFS very similar. What this is going to do is give us some good upper level support right in this area to produce a low, and that's the low that we keep seeing here on Monday into Tuesday. While this is happening though, we notice that heights are building, so ridging is happening out west and off of the northeast coast. And that's something I want you to key in on, because as I move you into next week, we start to say, well, why does the pattern stay so active down here from basically eastern Texas all the way through the northeast? Well, it's all coming around the base of this trough. And so that flow pattern here, strong upper level support for active systems in the middle and end of next week, all rounding the base of that trough. We do notice this as well. As we get out here to the 13th, 14th, and 15th, the trough reestablishes, which means we're going to keep getting cooler air pushing into the mid part of the country. And again, it's as you leave this trough going into this next ridge where things get more volatile. Now, as we play forward on this, it's interesting to see what's going on in the North Atlantic versus the North Pacific. I have what's called the positive phase of the North Atlantic Oscillation setting up. That's a trough over Greenland and a ridge to the south here over the Canadian Maritimes getting into the open North Atlantic. And that is a pattern that helps reinforce cold air here, but not so much as you get just off the coast. So again, that's why things look so active in the week 2 time period from eastern Texas all the way through the northeast. It's just a strong jet stream flow that comes into this region. Meanwhile, with ridging happening over the west, we slide into a drier pattern. And the west, well, the story is going to be told there by the upstream pattern. And that is largely going to be held in the hands of what happens over the Aleutian Islands. And that's what I'm going to spend the second part of this video discussing, is what happens over the Aleutian Islands. I think that's the critical piece moving forward. So let's take a look at it here. What I've got next is your next 5 days. So over the next 5 days, remember we saw the pattern really kind of broadly ridging here with the deeper trough off the East Coast. So the cooler weather here along the east with a warming trend in the central part of the United States. Both models keyed in on that. But see the storehouse of colder air sitting up here in northern Canada? Well, that, along with a bit more of an amplified pattern, comes down through the Canadian prairies and starts to move through the Great Lakes states, through the northern plains, into the U.S. as we get out here to the time period that's going to be like the 9th through the 14th. We can see that pretty clearly here in the European as well. Now, why, as we get out to day 11 through 15, which takes us all the way out to the 19th of December, is the European not as cold? Well, if you remember, it was keeping a much bigger ridge here off the east coast, limiting the penetration of that colder air. Well, the U.S. model, the GFS, isn't doing that. It's got a much broader ridge and therefore letting much more of that colder air sink through the central part of the United States toward the south and towards the east. So the GFS has been our colder of the two models, although it's backed off in the most recent run with how cold it is trying to make the third week of the month of December. So that's at least a near-term look at your temperatures. So as we look out farther, this is what I want to discuss. The last time we saw cold air kind of penetrating from the Canadian prairies into the central United States toward the east was back on the 8th of November through the 15th. This is the temperature pattern we had. Okay, west warm, big colder outbreak in the mid part of the country. Well, what did the pattern look like that kind of led up to that? So look at this. This is the 7th of November through the 15th. We had a trough south of the Aleutian Islands, ridge up the west coast getting into Alaska, deep penetrating trough anchored over the Hudson Bay toward the Great Lakes. Ridge here in the North Atlantic, deep trough over Europe, and another ridge here over Western Russia. Now, my question is, are we going to continue to see something like that, which gave us the very, very active end of November and beginning of December? Is it going to set up like that again? Well, the downstream flow, which means, I'm talking about if I center everything on the United States, the downstream flow, which means this trough, that ridge, this trough, and that ridge are very similar to what we had. But it's the upstream part that's missing. There's no dominant ridge that's kind of pushing up the west coast, at least not as big as it was. And I think the main story in our forecast is going to be what happens right here. You see, right now, getting out to the middle of the month, we do have a Aleutian low, but it's more centered toward the Bering Sea rather than south of the Aleutian Islands like it was. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is changing to change the position of that Aleutian low? And why are we getting a different look at our upstream blocking, that would be the North Pacific, versus our downstream blocking, which is the North Atlantic, which looks exactly the same as it did before? So here's what I think the changes are. One, we're still waiting to fill in this part of the Chukchi Sea. It should have already been filled in with ice up to about here, and it's still ice-free. So while we're still on the lower side of our climatological normal for this time of year, it is trying to fill itself in, but it's just taking its dear sweet time. Secondly, back on November 15th, look at what our polar vortex was doing. It was oriented like this. How is it oriented now? Like that. See? And the difference here is going to change the way that things respond in this area. Now, unfortunately, it oftentimes takes a while for the troposphere and the stratosphere, which you're looking here at the stratosphere, to kind of connect and interact. But this is certainly a different look of these way in the upper level winds compared to what we had half a month ago. And therefore, I see some changes in that upstream flow. Again, that's the North Pacific. Keeping on with this, when we had that really big colder outbreak, the Mad-Julian Oscillation was coming out of phase 6 into phase 7 and over towards phase 8. And that is, you can see, are correlated well over that same time period with big cold air outbreaks that come out of the Canadian prairies. Our MJO right now, because of what's going on with the Indian Ocean Dipole, is kind of stuck here in phase 1 and 2, and it's going to slowly try to get over into phases 3 and 4, which means that by the end of the month, the chances of it getting way over here are very kind of low at this point. So I keep looking for reasons to try to understand if the pattern's going to change or not. Remember, too, back half a month ago, our Indian Ocean Dipole was at a much higher place, about here. It's since been coming down in strength. And while it's still probably our most dominant feature, you can see here that the upper level support for more rain over this part of Africa and initially drier conditions over Australia. Well, by the time I get out to the 15th, 16th, and 17th, we see that that strong subsidence kind of goes away. I'm talking about right here. So again, this is an upstream effect that's impacting our downstream flow, which is over the United States. So is the pattern going to persist like we've been seeing it into week 3 and week 4 of December? Well, the rundown looks like this. IOD, Indian Ocean Dipole, still strong but fading. It's actually giving us more La Nina-like pattern in the upper levels of the atmosphere. Despite that, our Southern Oscillation Index over the last 30 days is still negative, which actually looks like El Nino. What's the conclusion there? Our El Nino region is not telling the story. This is all just a response to the Indian Ocean Dipole. MJO is stuck, which means it's not out moving around in those phases 6, 7, and 8. And in the meantime, we get a pattern that features a ridge on the east coast and a ridge on the west coast. That is the North Atlantic Oscillation in the PNA. Let me be clear here. A ridge just off the east coast and a ridge along the west coast. I'm waiting on the Arctic to connect with the polar vortex event that's happening. In the meantime, I can't really use it as a strong indicator. And what do I know? I know that the North Pacific is still very warm. I also know this. I've been monitoring our global models, the CFSV2 and the ECMWF. You might be saying, why aren't you showing us those, Eric? They've been performing quite poorly. So I want to know, are we going to stay with that kind of pattern, or are we going to flip this around and change things up? I think the answer to this is going to lie here in the Aleutian Island region. And this is why I think that. Over the last 2 weeks, what we have seen is we've been seeing low pressure systems that have come out of the Aleutian Islands and then been shoved down here into this area. And that's allowed for ridging to build in behind it, amplifying the pattern, sending a ridge over the southeast and a super active pattern in the midsection of the country that then dives into a trough as it goes off the northeast part of the United States. That's what we've seen from the 15th all the way through the 1st of December. So what we analyzed, this was the end result of it. Are we going to continue to see this particular pattern moving forward? To answer that question, I have to take you to Siberia and to the Aleutian Islands. We've seen the Siberian high come off of an anomalously high time period back over toward lower than average pressure. That's clue number one. Clue number two, look here at the last half month or so of what the Aleutian low has been doing. It has been oscillating, which means it's not really stuck in one phase or the other. So our flow pattern, as we move through the next 3 weeks, will be dominated by if that Aleutian low continues to stay in an unblocked pattern. We do know that downstream, the North Atlantic is blocked, but not upstream. So this is what I want to watch out for. You see, I'm going to show you the correlation with something called the North Pacific Index and our 500 millibar high pattern, troughs and ridges. Okay, when the North Pacific Index is positive, we end up getting a big ridge that sits here. That allows a deep trough to dive into the northwest, very wet. Ridge builds right here over the southeast and a very active pattern. Okay, so are we seeing something like this happening as we move forward? Well, remember, if we're going to see it, we're also going to get very weak winds here, and a much faster winds that do this, and then crank through the midsection of the country. I think we're going to see a version of this, but we're going to miss out on one critical piece, and that's right here in the mid part of the Pacific Ocean. So I think that the Pacific Ocean with time is actually going to be going over toward more of a zonal pattern. And there's some evidence of this when we look out longer term with our European ensemble. We see right in through this area stronger winds. Now what does that mean? That means we're going to get a much weaker version of what I just detailed for you. I think at times we will see a strong Aleutian low that sets up. And when it does, it's going to split the flow like this and give us a strong subtropical branch that cranks things up on the eastern half of the country. But at other times, I think that Aleutian low is going to fade in strength just like it's been doing. And that's going to allow for some temporary deeper troughs to form on the west coast. So what am I trying to tell you here? I think as we move forward in this forecast time period, the Aleutian low oscillation going up, down, keeps our pattern kind of on this week on, week off kind of thing. And I think that's going to persist through the end of the month. This week's coming up is going to be kind of a week off for the Midwest. But then when we get over into week 2, it gets very active again, especially along the south. I think as we go into the following week, the pattern goes right back over to what it was. So this is my diagnosis of how the upstream flow pattern is affecting everything. And I'll finish it with this one last thought here. When I correlate sea level pressure with that North Pacific Index, we tend to see big time ridges setting up here. I don't think we're going to see something permanent like that happening. And the reason why is because of this. You see, the one persistent factor in this whole forecast is the warm North Pacific. And that warm North Pacific tends to shove, most of the times, a lot of moisture right here into British Columbia and into Alaska. It does occasionally give us a much stronger subtropical jet stream. And because of that, that's why I say at times we're going to be bringing in more cutoff lows to California, not in week 2, but after that. And this is going to help strengthen that subtropical jet, keeping things active here, I think, as we get toward the end of the month. Biggest wild card, when that polar vortex, which if you just imagine is right now spinning like this, when it finally connects with the troposphere, it will change the Aleutian Island region first. And that is our upstream flow pattern setup, which means it'll be nearly impossible to pin down what the remainder of winter is going to look like until that connection is made. Everything else, as you just saw me detail, all of our other connections, teleconnections, are all quite weak. So we're going to have to live very carefully within a 2-week window on our forecast time period. But if I thought I knew one thing about this upcoming winter, strong subtropical jet, I think is going to be something we're going to see quite a bit of. So we'll wrap it up right there. Look forward to giving you another update tomorrow morning to see how all of these features kind of evolve. And we'll also give you an important update about what's going on in South America then. Have a great day. We'll talk to you again tomorrow. Thank you.